Good afternoon. Welcome to the last small session of the day where we're talking about universal basic income. I'm Amy Houston. I'm a professor at the business school and I run a place called the Thompson Family Foundation. And our goal for today is to really unpack what we mean by universal basic income or cash transfer and talk to two of the people who are running some of the most interesting experiments in this space today to understand both how they're approaching it and what the ultimate impact could be. I'm going to do a little bit of framing and a little bit of history, and then we're going to go through a set of questions, and then we'll open up to you all for your questions over at the mic there. First let me introduce Amy Castro-Baker and Michael Fay, and give you a little bit of context. So everyone can hear me? Okay, this microphone, good? Good, okay. So, you know, universal basic income as a concept has been around for centuries. Thomas Paine is kind of the first one on record as talking about how it could be used. When he studied the Iroquois, he saw, and he had this kind of idea, quote unquote, the toll that human invention had taken on society was too high. So he proposed that at the age of 21, everyone would be given 15 pounds, and then 10 pounds every year thereafter until they turned 50, which it would end, and I guess you would die. So then, you know, there have been proponents as diverse as Nixon to Napoleon to Martin Luther King, who all kind of got behind this idea in one fashion or another. There have been a number of studies starting in the 60s and going forward through today. And I think that two things. One, rising income inequality, or our understanding and recognition of it, has accelerated the conversation in the past decade. And in the past couple of years, all of the work and the studies that have been done on the impact of artificial intelligence have kind of really brought it to the forefront. And now, of course, we have one of our candidates for 2020 who has universal basic income as his singular platform. So I would say that the concept has, you know, officially arrived on the scene. Let me start in terms of definition with the idea of cash transfer. So this is really rooted in kind of a social justice idea of people in the bottom percentages of the ladder should have access to the economy. So can we give a basic income or a basic cash transfer to low-income people so that they can participate in the economy? That's kind of level, you know, kind of 101. Now, a lot of cash transfers are called conditional cash transfers. And the idea is you put conditions on them. So in one famous study in Mexico, low-income people got a cash transfer provided their kids stayed in school and that they accessed health clinics, services from the local health clinic. So the idea was, in addition to the cash, that you're also taking advantage of additional government benefits designed to lift people out of poverty. So the dollars would be leveraged. That's the idea of conditions. But a lot of people reject that notion and they say we should be unconditional, AKA the money should change hands free from any conditions. One, because give people money and they'll spend it well. And it's not for anyone else to design how that money should be spent. And two, you take out the bureaucracy and the cost of administering conditional cash transfer, you reduce waste and inefficiency. Then, universal basic income is basically like a blowout of this idea. Not only is it unconditional, but it is given to everyone. Everyone within a country, theoretically. Everyone, you know, citizens or non-citizens, we don't, you know, to be defined. You know, everyone, regardless of age, to be defined. But theoretically, the population of a country or of the world. And this is the you know, the largest notion. So that's my brief framing. I'd love to start with you all just talking to us a little bit about your career path. So, because people really are always interested in, like, how did you get where you are? So don't, you know, not 10 minutes, but give us like the 3-minute version of how you got to the place that you're in. And then we're going to dive deep into the work that you currently do.
Sure. I guess I'm first because I'm to your left.
I'll flip you back
Sure.
and forth. So Amy, you start this one.
Okay. Yeah, career path. So I started out as a social worker. I'm still a social worker. And as far as, how did I get from practicing social work to being co-PI of SEED is, and it's actually a pretty direct line. So when I started my PhD, it was just before the housing bubble. It was right before the recession hit. And I happened to be doing community development, looking at mortgage foreclosure, but I didn't have the language yet to understand that that's what I was looking at. So what I ended up watching was sort of the seeds of the housing crisis unravel black wealth in a community that I've been working in. So just naturally said, well, obviously that's what I'm going to focus my dissertation on, and started studying the gender-racial wealth gap and mortgage foreclosure and how those things kind of overlapped. Anyone who's familiar with the recession knows the data's not positive. It's basically depressing. And at a certain point, it was sort of like I could continue my career telling everybody how big and bad everything is, or I could take a risk and try studying interventions that actually might alleviate poverty. So in a roundabout way, that's sort of how I ended up becoming interested in studying guaranteed income and conditional, unconditional cash transfers. It's sort of just being a social worker and being like, I'm really tired. We keep doing this the same way with little tiny effect sizes, and we're not getting anywhere. So why not take a risk and try something new? So that's essentially, in sum, how I ended up where I am.
And a lot of schooling.
A lot of schooling, but a lot of practice. I think for students that are here, there is no substitute for spending time in the field. You cannot just go straight through and expect to do meaningful community-based work on poverty. It's just not going to happen.
Thank you. Michael?
Yeah, so I was a math and classics major in college, super useful, and then had an opportunity to go to Ecuador to teach English, which raised all kinds of questions in my mind, but also it was the year Ecuador dollarized, so there's just a lot of really visible poverty. Came back to the US, decided I wanted to work on development, knew nothing. Someone introduced me to economics and said, you better take a lot of classes quickly if you want to get into graduate school. That's what I did. I wound up doing some research for Jeff Sachs, who's now at Columbia. Went with him to the UN for 2 years, just when they were setting up the Millennium Project. Thought some of the more kind of impressive folks and exciting folks that I had met at the UN, which could have been a weird selection, were economists and decided to go get a PhD. So went back to Harvard to do a PhD in econ. And this was early 2000s, which is when economists actually started testing rigorously what worked and what didn't work in development. So for 50 years or so at this point, we had sort of used intuition, but we now started to use A/B tests, which is what the pharmaceutical industry uses before they give you a drug, to test what worked in poverty alleviation. The big surprise was a lot of the favorites at the time, microfinance, kind of extension services training, just didn't really have the impact anyone would have liked to see. And it turned out Mexico and Brazil had taken this chance to give poor people money. And they also decided to evaluate it. And the results were pretty astounding, because we had all assumed poor would just waste it, they would stop working, it would be a disaster. It turns out it wasn't a disaster. Where that led was, I have a stipend, maybe I should give some money to people. Well, it turned out to be a lot harder than it sounded. A lot of the NGOs still today wouldn't take money to just deliver to a recipient. And then we decided okay, we'll start this for ourselves, and then other people wanted to do it, and then it grew little by little, it being Give Directly, of course.
Great. So I'm going to keep going with you, Michael, and ask you to talk about Give Directly, kind of in design, goal, design, and execution. Wow. High level.
So Give Directly's goal is to get resources to the extreme poor and take a fraction of the resource envelope that we as an aid and philanthropy sector spend and let the poor decide that for themselves. And in the process also change the aid industry. I think there's a lot of inefficiency, there's a lot of paternalism in the industry, and there are a lot of things that are not as effective as we would like. It turns out cash is a good vehicle for addressing a lot of those. It puts the decision, the dignity, the choice into the hands of the recipient. The evidence is that poor use it well, and it's pretty efficient in terms of how much you can get to a recipient. So you can get about 90 cents on the dollar to a recipient.
Perfect. Amy?
Can you just repeat exactly what you wanted?
Tell us about the study. high-level goal
Okay.
design and execution.
Got it. Okay. So I'm the co-PI of the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration, which is working with Mayor Michael Tubbs in Stockton, California. And what we're doing is we've given 125 randomly selected households $500 a month for 18 months, no strings attached. So unconditional cash transfer. The money is given on a debit card, so that refills every month. And our goals, wow. So there's our hypotheses, which is our research aims, which I'll hold off on those for now and talk more about sort of, the 50,000-foot view of what we're looking to do. What we're looking to do is jumpstart a conversation around deservedness and the social safety net. So we're doing that in two ways. One, by generating rigorous empirical evidence for policymakers, for our peers as researchers, but then two, generating narrative shift with the public. So really leaning into this idea that we have to have different types of evidence for different audiences. And you'll see some of that if you follow SEED in the press or in some of the documents that we're putting out. So that's really on the top level. What we're trying to do is to, one, figure out what works. Because if someone were to scale it up, how would it interact with the existing safety net? How would it interact with the IRS, for instance? What works, what doesn't work, okay? But then also having this conversation around deservedness in a just economy.
Okay, sticking with Amy, as you thought about the design of the study, what were the things that you struggled with the most in terms of choice? And I'm sure there are struggles all the way, but the road not taken, the things that you wish you could have done, or just the tricky decisions you had to make when you go and you're going to study something for a set of years. You all are 18 months. Michael, you're what, 10 years?
Yeah, 12.
12 years. So walk us through some of that decision making.
Ooh, that's such a good question. I love the way that you framed it in terms of the paths not taken. I think, to be totally honest, the thing that has been, or was in the past, the most difficult about designing the research around SEED is that it's not mine. And so as a social worker, I adhere to the Social Work Code of Ethics. We really believe in self-determination and agency. And the ethos behind the project is really similar to Michael's. People are the experts on their own lives. So, we had a challenge. It's a city-led experiment. It is not about my research agenda per se, it's about the city of Stockton. So there was really all of this buzz around the mayor and who's gonna get the $500, right? So at one point we actually had to hold a press conference on our sampling strategy. Like that's how sort of, how much pressure we were under in terms of the community. And so it's interesting is that we had, me and my co-PI, Dr. Martin West, we had our own ideas about what we wanted to study and how we wanted to sample. And each time we went back to the community to get feedback, they gave us better feedback because, again, people are the experts on their own lives. So we really wanted to
give us an example of
yeah,
that?
perfect. Yeah, one example would be, we were really interested in seeing, for instance, how would a guaranteed income work alongside, let's say Section 8 housing recipients, right? Or particular family household composition, right? Or just other things of that nature. Stacia and I both have done a lot of prior research on housing, so we really had a housing interest. But when we went back to the community, we heard two things over and over again. One, people really wanted the process to feel fair, that sort of everyone in Stockton had an equal chance of being chosen into the sample. And two, they did not want the money to be recaptured in taxes. So with that feedback in mind, what we ended up doing was doing a random selection through mailers at census tracts at or below the median income. And what's interesting is that we were really stuck on that because we weren't sure how to sample in a way that was just, and it turns out that by passing it off to the community, we actually ended up with a more rigorous design.
I love it.
So they challenged me, like, you really think people are the experts on their own lives? Why don't you let us collaborate with you in the research? Okay, so yeah, it challenges all of my bias and control as a researcher because I have to pass it off.
Yeah, challenge accepted. Okay, and Michael, you're 12 years. The road's not taken, the tricky issues in design.
I had a few minutes to think about it. I'm afraid I still don't have a good answer. So I think one thing we talked a lot about was length. And given the funding constraints, there's an obvious trade-off between the number of people and the length that you can do. And then we made one design choice, which is to add a treatment arm where people are getting money not for 12 years, but for 2 years. And that was an obvious trade-off because we're spending money on that. And the logic behind it was there's a lot of cash research. A lot of it goes under the name UBI, and we can talk about what is and what isn't a UBI. It's a mess in the media. But
that's a good way of putting it. You're right.
Yeah. So we thought, okay, look, there are a lot of cash programs that we have evidence on that are 2-year programs. Let's at least get that in there as a comparison so that we can potentially extrapolate from some of those to the 12-year. Maybe it looks the same, maybe it looks totally different. And then the message is, every time we see a 2-year study, we shouldn't necessarily say this is what would happen if we gave everybody money forever, because it's not what would happen. When you give for 12 years, maybe people leave their jobs, maybe they go back to school, maybe they make these really long-term choices you just can't make with 2 years of income. So that was the logic behind it.
Okay, perfect. And I promise to dig into the mess in the media and the larger conversation and definitions in a second. Can you talk to us just a little bit about how you're thinking about evaluation? So I'll start with you, Michael. Just, how are you doing it? We didn't prep this, but what percentage is the cost of evaluation versus of your budget, approximately? And any things you really hope to see? And if you want to talk about some initial results, I know Amy's got some, and I forget if you all do.
We don't.
Okay.
We're just the surveys in the field literally today.
Wow.
Not before today, but we were on the phone today. So I think, I'm going to get this wrong, but I think it's probably about 5%.
Yep.
Ballpark. And that's really a guesstimate. I think we're doing a randomized trial, which I think is important. We've got external academics involved, which I think is important. And then honestly, a lot of the research winds up being in the real nitty-gritty of how do you phrase the question, what questions are in there. Because when you do a 12-year UBI, everybody calls and wants to add their question because it's the most important, and you wind up with a 12-hour survey instead of a several-hour survey, which is already excruciating long for someone to sit through. So that's how we think about it, randomized, external, and then I think something that we probably won't be sufficiently powered to do, but I think is important, less so with universal basic income where everyone's getting, but with a more traditional cash program, is understanding the impact not just on the people that get, but the people that don't get, which I think is a systemic shortcoming of a lot of research, that we always focus on who gets something, not who doesn't get something. So there's actually a paper not yet released. We're waiting for the academics to release it. That was a different Give Directly project that was designed purposely to estimate the impact of cash on non-cash recipients and the macroeconomy. And the question that I certainly started with is, does cash impact other people? And when you think about it for a second, it's a really silly question. Because unless people burn cash, the entire point of money is to interact with other people. So it must be, in fact, affecting them somehow. Well, it turns out that other people are doing better. Incomes increase, consumption increases of other people, which is what you'd expect as the market churns. So I give the money to a shopkeeper who's just sold more, and he'll spend it, and so on and so forth.
Thank you. Amy, do you want to talk about any evaluation choices?
I think just, for some clarity, just take a step back and talk about sort of who our funders are and what that looks like. Because again, we're working, alongside, adjacent to a mayor, so I think it's important to be clear about that. So first, SEED, the actual $500 that's going to recipients, that's funded by the Economic Security Project, which is co-funded by Chris Hughes, who co-founded Facebook, and Natalie Foster. So that particular organization, along with some other private donors, are actually funding the implementation, the actual $500. There's no tax dollars used whatsoever. Then on the evaluation side, which is where I sit as co-PI, we're funded through Evidence for Action program at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, which is key, right? Because if you remember what I said before, we're interested in generating a public conversation, but it needs to be rigorous, and it needs to be empirically driven, not just politically driven, right? So, we've got kind of two different sources in terms of, keeping that firewall of funding and making sure that it's clear that it's not coming from tax dollars. And then as far as the evaluation goes, man, there's so many things that we're doing. The one thing I would say that's probably the biggest strength of our program in comparison to, it's a trade-off issue really, is that we're using mixed methods. So because it's smaller, what we're able to do is not just figure out what, but why and how, right? So we have quantitative aims that we're looking at, every 6 months, taking traditional surveys like you would expect. We're also capturing data via text message every month on income volatility because like most of you probably can't remember how many times you used your debit card this week. You might think you do, but you don't, right? So trying to have recall every 6 months on your income is really, really difficult. So we're experimenting with some text-based data collection. But then we're also doing semi-structured interviews. So when we have signal changes quantitatively that we can't explain or that we need to know more about, we're doing in-depth interviews with recipients to find out how and why and how are you making sense of the experiment. And then the third piece is participatory action research, which is people who are not receiving the $500, they're not in treatment or control, and they're working with us to collaborate and have a community dashboard, which we just launched on Saturday. So you can actually go to our website and see the spending data from seed in real time. And that was co-constructed with Stocktonians. So complicated project, a lot of different pieces, but again, kind of really rooted in this ethos that the community had to own it.
Mm-hmm. And Michael, can you remind us where your funding comes from?
Oh gosh. So to differentiate, so Give Directly as an organization has raised about $270 million or so. The UBI project is a subset of that. It's kind of in the 20 plus range of what we're doing. So I'm going to forget people, so I shouldn't even attempt. It's a number of foundations, a number of wealthy individuals. I forget who's public and who's anonymous at this point.
Yeah, it's fine.
But it's a real mix. And the
private
public.
funding from foundations and individuals.
And the public.
corporations.
The thing about Kenya, which I think is remarkable, is that the food poverty line is about 75 cents a day, which is what we're transferring to people. So it's well within the reach of any individual to fund someone over the 12 years. I think it turns out $22 a month, which is pretty amazing as an opportunity in the world that for $22 a month, you can guarantee that somebody will be above the food poverty line. So.
Okay, back to Amy. When you think about this larger topic, what are one or two of the biggest myths or areas of confusion that you would like to kind of take on and clarify?
Anything more specific?
Yeah. People think X, but really they need to understand why.
That's a great way to put it.
You could do one.
Yeah. So, again, really this is about deservedness, right? And so the questions we get are pretty predictable. How much of the $500 is going to drugs? How much of the $500 is being spent in ways that are irrational or poor decision making, right? And so there's this kind of real fixation on people who are living at or below the poverty line to figure out how they're using their money. But it's interesting, we don't ask that question of people when they get a dividend at the end of the year. And we don't ask that question when you get a bonus, right? We only add that layer of deservedness on top of people who are at the lower end of the income distribution, right? So what we're seeing with our early data in seed is 40% of the $500 was actually transferred off of the debit card. And when we went and interviewed people to say why, tell us what was your strategy. It turns out people were incredibly strategic and very rational. So Stockton's a city that's been unbanked, underbanked, and it was the foreclosure capital of the country. So you cannot live in Stockton and not have an experience with fraud or being targeted for predatory lending. So people they're looking at the news, they're seeing other UBI experiments closing down in other parts of the globe, and they get that money on that debit card, and they say, who says it's a guarantee? I'm going to move this money instantly to a bank I know and I trust, right? So I think that speaks to what mixed methods can do, but it also speaks to the fact that people are really savvy. So we have this assumption that you can budget your way out of injustice, which you can't, right? And what we're learning in this particular project is that people who have to live paycheck to paycheck, they really know how to leverage because they know sort of down to the day, down to the hour when their money's going to run out. And what we've seen thus far is that they are using the $500 similarly. So they're mapping that behavior, that $500 onto those existing behaviors and saying, this is what I need to pay first, this is when to pay second, this is how I'm going to leverage this money to do X, Y, or Z for my family.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, so it's a very simple answer. I think a lot of people think the extreme poor are poor because they're dumb or lazy. And they're not. Poverty is a lack of resources. It's not a lack of intellect. One of the things that reflects that to me is the number of times there's been research on whether cash works. So ballpark, there are probably about 200 robust studies on the question of what's the impact of giving someone cash. That's probably 5x or so the next most evaluated intervention. why are we still asking the question about whether the poor waste money? And it's really worth some reflection. And what if we ask the question of ourselves, the sector, as frequently, are we wasting money? Are we effective? Because we tend not to evaluate ourselves quite as much as we seem to evaluate the poor. So I think that's probably the biggest misconception. And then if we want to go into the wonky misconception about what UBI is and how the media gets it wrong.
Yeah, you can go there.
So I will tell you my definition of UBI, which I think it really probably is person specific. So there are 3 parts. Universal, which means that everybody gets. There's no targeting. We're not going to try to find the poorest people in this room or give to people over a certain age. It's everybody. So it's universal. Now that may be by country, by state, by region, but some degree of universality. It's basic, so it's not a large amount of money to invest. It's enough for consumption and to get you over some minimum threshold of existence. In Kenya, we use the food poverty line. And the last is its income. It's not a one-time thing. It's over a long time. It's for a lifetime, presumably. So that's the purest form of universal basic income. Now, to my knowledge, that's never been tried. And in fact, the only one that goes beyond 5 years is the one that we're doing in Kenya. And even that's not perfect. It's not all of Kenya. It's only 12 years. So it itself has limitations. So thinking about the various projects and how they map to the kind of purest form of a UBI is really important. So you'll see things that are a one-time transfer that get called UBI. To me, that looks nothing like a UBI, and probably very little we can learn. You look at the Finland experiment, which was essentially a replacement for unemployment benefits, which has nothing to do with UBI. Part of UBI is that you get rid of these disincentives to working. So many of you know this, but the poor in this country face some of the highest marginal tax rates, because as they make a little bit of money, they lose their benefits, higher than the wealthy in many cases. UBI says that's not going to happen. As you move up, you're still getting your same, whether it's $10,000 a month or $22 a month, you're getting your same amount. So you get rid of that disincentive. Some of the programs out there bake in a disincentive to work and then are shocked and say UBI causes people to stop working. Well, when you incentivize people to stop working, people stop working. So I think it's just take each of these projects in context and try to understand what exactly it is and go beyond just the blanket heading of UBI.
Great. Good on this one?
Yeah, I think the one thing I'd add, great definitions, that was fantastic. The one thing I'd add is that, the way that I think the media gets it wrong is that we fixate on this question of, how are we going to pay for it when we're the richest country in the world? We make policy choices. And then number 2, jumping to the question of employment as though we're not already working too much. Like, we're the richest country in the world and we work more hours than anybody else and we take the least amount of vacation, right? So to me, sort of fundamentally as a researcher, it's not are people going to just stop working altogether. It's clear they're not going to from the number of studies that we've seen. But to ask a question, what does dignified work mean in our current context?
Okay. Let's stick on the kind of big national conversation. You've got Andrew Yang, the Yang Gang, and this big idea around UBI that he's come out with. When you think about Yang in the national conversation, is he a help or a hindrance to your work, and how?
Oh, me first. I think about it for a minute. Yeah, look, I think at this point, people are so far from understanding how other people use money and the potential benefits to those folks and that they don't waste it, that to have this in the national conversation and be forcing a dialogue is really helpful and important. Because a lot of people haven't even been exposed to the idea of, wait, you can just give money to people? That's weird. Well, we actually give boxes of food and other things to people now, and one thing we often forget is markets work. Which I guess we're in a business school now, but markets work. And some of the craziest stories around like food aid and whatnot is how many people actually sell it. So in Syria, 70% of people will sell their food aid for cash to buy what they want. And that's not uncommon. So we spend all this money because we think they need food, and that's what we need to get them, and then they just sell it and buy other stuff. So I think forcing that debate and opening room for it is important.
Yeah, I mean, in my class, my policy class, I teach impact in government and policy analysis, and we have a chapter that we start the semester with called, when does an idea, how do you know when idea's time has come, right? And so with having UBI on the national stage, particularly in the DNC, that's really a question we get a lot, like, why now, I think income inequality has a lot to do with it. As far as like, what does it mean for our work? On the conversation front, I think it's fantastic because we're finally having a public conversation of what it means to have dignity around the market, which we're long past due. But then second, from an implementation perspective, I do have some pause and some concern. So, reason being, if we rush forward without knowing what works and how, we run the risk of reproducing new forms of inequality because it's baked in, right? So it took us, 200 years of market exclusion to get to the point that we're at now. There's no one policy solution that's going to get us out, right? So if we jump forward too quickly without the science behind it to know not just does it work, but how should it actually be implemented on the ground, in the community, by cohort, by demographic, that type of thing, we run the risk of either reproducing inequality or creating new forms of it. And historically, when we think about the safety net, we tend to not do this very well. We design policy in isolation, and then there's unintended consequences. So on the one hand, phenomenal. Yes, I love the fact that the press is interested and that people want to talk about it, right? But then on the other hand, it's you want the implementation to be there so that we do it well, and we don't end up with something like we did with TANF, where we built this welfare to work program. We didn't ask the question, how do we actually get these women who we are moving off of TANF to work? Like physically on a bus to the location. Like those are the types of things that we haven't thought through yet. So it's a both and.
So let me keep going with that. When you think about scaling your efforts, what are the things that you worry about when you when you think about take my work and then really imagine it at scale? What are the things that we most need to think about and consider when we put experiments into a national or international conversation?
I guess I can go first. So we're looking a lot at implementation, like I said, and we have the benefit of being able to do that because we have a really small sample size. And the thing that I sort of have concern about, but it's also really exciting, is to think, we had a fintech session. If anyone was in here in the session before, it was on fintech, and it's fascinating to me that we have hundreds and hundreds of varieties of the ways that we think about financial services, right? And yet the conversation scientifically around UBI and guaranteed income is, there's one way to do it, and that's it. And what I know from what I'm looking at in my own project and in others is that people experience and make sense of cash differently depending on how they experience the market prior, right? So if I think about the way that sort of my grandmother interacts with her bank, it's pretty different than the way that my kids interact with the debit cards that I give them that I monitor, right? So thinking about, if we're coming to the table with different histories of accumulated disadvantage, right? If we then scale it up and scale it out, how would those programs need to be tailored to meet people's needs so they can actually use the cash and access it in a way that has dignity to it and to where they have trust in institutions? Because if you've already been excluded from the market over generations by your zip code, you're pretty disincentivized to engage with any type of UBI or guaranteed income. And so thinking about how we build some of that trust back in if you were to scale it up and scale it out, that's probably the thing that we're interested in the most.
Michael, do you want to talk about risks of scaling or things?
Yeah, sure. I'll be quick. I think in development as a field, we often talk about the idea of bed nets, training, cash. And I also run a startup. In the startup world, you never talk about the idea and you talk about the execution. And I think development should adopt some of that, which is the idea is worth something, but the execution really, really matters. And it gets lost often in policy and academic discussions. So one is just execution matters. Two, so we've obviously scaled a lot, certainly in our first countries, Kenya and Uganda. What are the things that matter? Obviously fraud. People get more sophisticated at gaming the system, so you need to stay ahead of it. You become much more relevant to the government. So you have to be very conscious and work with the government. What areas are you working? Where are you working? You don't want to bias things, and you want to work in coordination. That becomes more relevant. And then there's all the org decisions about what do you start to centralize and what do you have decentralized. We're in 8 countries now, so obviously finance would be something centralized. Tech right now is largely centralized, but starting to think through those questions show up as you scale.
Is there, what is the impact, or do we know anything about the impact on either inflation, and how does UBI interact with the tax code?
So the second one is very easy for us. The tax authority does not reach rural Kenya particularly well, so that's not an issue. The first one on inflation is a good question, because theoretically, if you just drop cash, prices could go up and you could see no real impact. I think there have been 2 studies give directly related. The first didn't find an increase in price and actually found that the price of fish dropped. And the more recent one, which was intentionally a very precise estimate of prices, finds that prices go up by less than 0.2% in that case. Now, that's not to say that there won't be contexts where you could design a cash program in a highly closed economy somewhere where prices go up. It's just that where we've chosen to work and whatnot, you have not seen that.
Okay. I'm going to open it up to outside questions at this microphone in a minute or two. So if you have one, please go ahead over. And I'm going to ask a couple until I see somebody there, and then I'm going to let the audience ask. Boil it up a level from your experiment, if you will. Talk about the other people that you're collaborating with. For Amy, I'm interested in who you're collaborating with and who your other partners are. And for Michael, I'm interested in the larger picture with Give Directly. So Amy, you want to start?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's traditional in terms of the, the research side. It's, myself and Dr. Martin West, who are the co-PIs. But one of the things that's interesting is that there are 3, fairly high-profile guaranteed income experiments happening right now in the U.S. Ours will have findings first because the timeline is 18 months. So we're working, I can't name the folks by name, but the co-PIs of these various experiments are working together to make sure that we're embedding common aims, or common scales across experiments, so that we're we each have strengths and weaknesses in terms of, duration, amount of treatment, sample size, those types of things. So we're trying to think really strategically about how do we create not competition within the scientific community, but collaboration, so that we're answering one set of questions that can then inform somebody else's hypotheses.
Got it. So some shareable data definitions and some different components of an experiment, so you can learn different things.
Exactly, yeah. So we're really intentionally saying, we're going to have findings earlier than the other experiments are because it's 18 months long, and that will be able to kind of inform the broader landscape. And so it's really about creating collaboration across PIs because there's so many unknowns, and one way to do that is just embedding common scales.
It's really exciting. Michael?
Yeah, so Give Directly, big picture, I think we started with this question of development and poverty, and what you realize is that the sector is a bit segmented. There's a humanitarian sector, one focused on refugees, and they're treated differently. Even though they will often live in settlements or camps for 10, 20 years, and it looks like a development situation, they will fall under the umbrella of humanitarian and get kind of the drip drop of food aid and other things. Can you give them large cash grants to move on and rebuild their lives? Disaster work. Disaster is some of the most wasteful spending you'll see. I was in Houston after Harvey, and you've got piles of plastic bottles and food trucks and stuffed animals, and the tap works and Walmart's open, and it's a bit silly. So can we start moving cash? We did it in Houston, we did it in Puerto Rico, we'll likely do it in Bahamas as well. So just thinking about the different kind of sectors within the overall aid envelope and how we can push them forward.
Great, thank you. Question from the group.
Yeah, hi. My name is Alin Gusic. I'm a second-year Mexican student at CIPA, School of International and Public Affairs. I've been thinking in my head how to make this very concrete, but I'm just making a big mess. So I'm focusing on social policy, and needless to say, I've studied conditional cash transfers in my classes, but I worked in the institute in Mexico that sort of spearheaded this movement and catered to 12 million people under the extreme poverty line. And I took a class with a presidential candidate from Mexico who also sort of like navigated on the UBI as his platform. He didn't say UBI because in Mexico it's a very like sensitive topic. And one of the things that I researched on, and I had the opportunity to speak with Santiago Levy, who was the architect behind Prospera Oportunidades and this cash transfer program, one floor below, actually in this very building, is that cash transfer programs lead to, as you said, unintended consequences, but also perversive incentives. And my question is, how do you foresee like UBI sort of lead to pervasive incentives? And if so, how do you think, like how would your organization address them? Because in Mexico, it's more of like changing the political landscape or legal political landscape to sort of attack or address these issues. But I was wondering like what your perspective is here in the US.
Beautiful, thank you.
I don't know much about that context, so I'll pass it to you since you're working internationally.
No, I mean like here.
UN.
Like how do you address it here?
Oh, here.
Yeah.
Um,
How do
so
you see that?
I think the first thing I would say is that I would ask, if we were in like a conversation about it in a paper, for instance, like what do you mean by perverse incentives, right? And so it's sort of the question of assumption of what people may or may not do with the money. Now we happen to be releasing spending data because we're tracking it on the debit card, but we actually don't really care, to be honest with you. I mean, the only reason we're releasing how people are spending the money is because the community wanted to know, and we made a commitment to transparency. But we're far more interested in saying, how does spending the $500 impact people's physiological well-being, their mental health, their sense of hope, their sense of mattering, the specific public health questions that we're asking, rather than seeing what is it that they're spending it on. It's how does spending it impact them as a human being along these various scales that we're looking at.
Michael, you want to add? Good? Okay,
That's a great question. Thank you for asking.
thank you. Please.
Hi, my name's Paul. I'm with the School of Public Health, but I also work at an advertising agency. So I'm nodding along, right? I love what you're saying, but I also know as an ad man that, reason and logic don't always motivate people. So I'm wondering how you would, given that, how you would kind of sell the benefits of a UBI program to someone who's a skeptic or doesn't think on the same lines. How would you communicate that, the benefit of UBI?
Yeah, so, look, I think it's really hard. Like hard cash is way less adorable than a goat or a cow that you can send someone. And it is probably not surprising that like a Give Directly donor will likely work at a hedge fund or be an engineer or kind of self-identify as more cerebral than emotional per se. Obviously, we're all emotional. So I don't know is the short answer. I think what we have tried to do, because we literally go door to door and enroll people, and we know who the people are, and we communicate with them regularly, we've started to basically disintermediate everything that normally sits between a recipient and a donor. So if you go to live.givedirectly.org, there's just a real-time feed of what recipients are saying in surveys and things. We're trying other things just to build that direct connection, because frankly, the poor have had the world's worst PR agency for the last 50 years to get to the point when we all think they're dumb or lazy or that is really bad. And I think there's no one better to correct that than them themselves.
Yeah, so we're actually leaning into that pretty hard and asking that question. I would start by saying scientists tell terrible stories. We are really, really bad at communicating why our data matters. If we did a better job with this, we'd be a little bit more quick on climate change, I think. We're just kind of coming around, right? And so from our perspective at Seed, what we've done is we've created a small politically propulsive sample of 25 individuals, and their outcomes and data is kept separate from the main treatment group. And we are, they're consented to, and they're intentionally sharing their stories in the press and with other people to talk about how their lives are changing with the introduction of the guaranteed income. And so to go back to what I said at the very beginning, we're looking to generate two types of evidence. One, empirical evidence for policymakers, researchers, and our peers, and then two, generating narrative and storytelling data to jumpstart a public conversation to where people are telling in their own words how it is that they're experiencing the program. And that seems to be working for the most part, and you can go to our dashboard and see videos of people talking about, I used to work at DoorDash and now I get to spend time with my kids. I think that that's far more powerful politically than any data I can give anyone.
I went to both of these this week and they were fantastic.
Thank
so
you.
I really
I need a shout out to my
appreciated them.
staff because they killed them in the past month building that thing, so thank you.
Yeah, it's beautiful. Okay, please.
Hi, so I'm in social work school, and it's a really interesting topic for me, but we can't ignore that in the past 2 or 3 years, this discrimination has become more visible with the administration that we have now, and there is we live in a society that values work maybe too much, and we have this mentality that if you work hard enough, you are gonna get to where you wanna get, and that regardless of where you start, you can get there. So my question to you is, how can we change that mentality from individuality to collaboration? Like, how do we teach people to care about the other person if they're doing well?
Thank you.
Leave it to the social work student to leave me speechless. So I think you're right? So I think the supposition that you're coming to with your question is correct, is that we have pervasive discrimination, but it's not as though this is brand new, right? So it's not like 2 years ago, it's like, oh, the world's racist now, right? So like we've been in this place for a really long time, right? And so on a practical level, what I would say is we need to think deeply about structural injustice and how markets are structured, and then how that plays out in terms of the safety net. Because if I sort of grant, intellectually, that the market itself is creating injustice, right, then I am admitting that I am at risk in that market as well. It's far easier for me to say this person should budget better, this person should do X better, than it is to ask the bigger question of how is our society structured. And so I think facilitating those types of conversations is really just one little step forward. And yeah, like keep on is what I would say. I don't know what you want to add to that.
There's a great answer. I think you need to personalize it with people, and there's nothing that changes people's mind like a trip to the field and just real in-depth one-on-one conversation sitting in someone's house. Now that's hard, and that's not scalable, and I don't think we've cracked how to make that scalable for people, but it does have such a profound impact and change on someone's views that if we can replicate it, I think that's where the solution will lie.
Thanks. Next question.
Hi. My name is Ki-dae Hong. I'm currently an MBA student at NYU Stern. And first of all, thank you very much for this very informative talk. So I have two questions. My first question is, I think that the poverty line in America is something close to like $1,000 of income a month. And so if Andrew Yang's proposal of $1,000 a month of universal basic income is implemented, then I think for the first time, America would be a country that has zero poverty. And so what happens to a country when it no longer has any form of poverty, not only on the lower income class, but also on the middle income class? And then my second question is, so I can see a lot of the upsides of universal basic income. I'm very interested to see how this develops. What are some of the potential, like the major potential downsides of a universal basic income?
It's
A
perfect.
world with no poverty.
Yeah.
So, remind me of the first question.
Yeah, what happens to a society when there's no longer any poverty?
So I think I would love to find out, and I think you highlight.
That was my.
Yeah, but I think you also
go there
highlight what's
together.
amazing about the question, which is it does become a bit of arithmetic. And there's this amazing graph, which I can't show, but if you look at the poverty gap in the world, so just the arithmetic amount of money it would take to get every person above the poverty line, that's been falling dramatically. India, China, so it's been falling over the last 35 years. If you look at how much money we've been sending to poor countries, it's been increasing over the last 35 years. And for the first time 15 years ago, those two lines crossed, which means that we send more in international aid and philanthropy than would be arithmetically required to close the poverty gap. Now, there are a lot of assumptions there. We don't know exactly who's poor. We don't know exactly how far below the poverty line they are. We can't magically send money. But as a thought experiment, it is fascinating to think that we now spend twice as much. So what if those resources were magically distributed and poverty was ended? What would you feel comfortable taxing people back for the money for? There are certainly things the answer is yes. National defense, vaccine research, roads, school. There are certainly things yes, but there are a whole lot of things that we're doing today for which the answer would be no.
Can you remind me of your second question?
Yeah, what are the potential major downsides of a universal basic income on society?
So there's two separate, kind of answers to that. There's sort of society, and then there's the market, right? So there's two different things. So in terms of the market side, what I would point you to is the work of my colleague Ioana Marinescu, and the work that she's done in the Alaska Dividend Fund. I think that that's probably the most robust and easily accessible answer to that. Potential downsides to society, it's hard to say because we haven't had it yet, right? And so this is where the researcher in me is so hesitant to answer because we don't know. And I think that that's a more interesting question, is to instead flip it the other way and say, what is it that we're missing out on? What are the innovations? What are the solutions? Who are the people that we're locking out, and what type of potential would we then unlock in communities and in the market if instead we had full inclusion, right? And so to me, it's sort of like, yeah, we don't know what the downsides are going to be because we haven't tried it yet, right? But I do know that our current situation is not working, right? So it's hard to say.
Just add one thing. I think there's the individual level impact of UBI, which our projects will hopefully help address somewhat. And then there's the way it's implemented from a policy perspective. And that, who knows, it depends on how you implement it. I am sure I could define ways where we don't tax anyone more, we just replace every benefit to the poor with UBI, including whatever, and that could be a very bad implementation of it. So I think you need to separate the kind of experimental individual impact from what it looks like in policy, which we just don't know.
Thank you so much. Next question.
Yes, in Stockton, is there any aspect of your research that's trying to gauge how people behaviorally or psychologically respond differently to UBI as opposed to current social welfare programs?
Yes. Stay tuned. So we're not releasing that data yet because it's still being collected, but those are our primary hypotheses. Yeah. So I would encourage you to, if you're curious, download our pre-analysis plan. We're really specific on what we're measuring. So yeah, can't say yet, but you can look and see what it is that we're measuring.
Can you say what you hope to see?
Okay. Okay. So here's the logic chain. The logic chain is, people are experiencing income volatility, meaning they cannot predict their income, they cannot predict their hours. If you can't predict those two things, then you can't budget, you can't plan for the future, and that shows up as stress and anxiety in the body, right? So the idea is, if we introduce guaranteed income, we smooth that income volatility, what type of change will we see on those health indicators? Okay, so stress and anxiety, because we know that economic inequality shows up in the body in terms of poor health outcomes. So one of the things we're doing is collecting administrative data, so we'll be able to follow these folks 10 years into the future to see what happens with them. So that's part of it. And then the third piece is we're using a scale that's not used very often called the mattering scale. And what the mattering scale does is it measures how much you feel you matter as an individual to the people who are in power and control over you. So this is something that we can actually measure alongside hope. And we can see if anxiety goes down, do people feel as though they are seen by the institutions that govern their lives? And this is really, really, because that sounds squishy, like does that matter? Do we care about that? But it's actually really crucial, because what we know is that if people have been excluded from the market, they're far less likely to try again if they feel they don't matter. So that's the other kind of key domain that we're leaning into, is to ask this question. What happens if people feel like they are fully included and seen by the institutions that govern their lives? Will they have a different sense of trust? Which is really what it comes down to for those of you who are in the business school. It's thinking about, how do you get your customers to trust you, right? Well, in this instance, it's how do I get my recipients to trust me, right? And so it's thinking about those pieces together.
I had a Kenya question, but we might not have time. If I want to make sure you get your question in.
Such kind Q&A people.
Yeah, and you're going to.
That was a great question too.
Okay, please, next question.
Hi, thanks for moderating the panel. Really good discussion. So the political science in me is just fascinated by the idea of UBI and all the implications that it has. Domestically, I think you can make a case for the value in terms of knowing how much you can give someone to aid them in terms of cost of consumption here. Mike, for you internationally, I'm Nigerian. How do you value that? Because cost of consumption shifts so much, right? So how do you say, we're giving X amount to X person, knowing that inflation happens literally every hour there?
Yeah, so there are two levels that we've used. One is the food poverty line. And you're right, I mean, it's $22 versus $1,000. So it's a pretty big gap between what that looks like. Two is we're trying to scale it with inflation, which I've left to the finance team to invest in the appropriate financial instruments to do so. So we are trying to scale it with inflation over time for Kenya.
Thanks.
Okay, circle back, and we're going to get you into. Go ahead.
So with the Kenya experiment, is there an eye towards how will UBI possibly make other economic development interventions more effective together, or is the end goal essentially, hey, if this works in Kenya, let's do this in the whole developing world because it's so cost effective?
So let me try to answer it, and I'm not sure I'm going to answer the right question, but let me
Real
give you
fast,
3
yeah.
parts. I'll be super quick. So no, we're not looking at UBI plus other things. That wasn't part of the design. There are some small nudges and behavioral, but small, not anything big. I think whether it's the right policy for Kenya or another country, again, gets into the policy question. So it's more complicated than that. And then the last thing is, cash is very strange from a philanthropic and a aid sector perspective. It is not from a national program. So cash transfer programs make up the bulk, the majority of national program spend in the emerging market. Like, that is the dominant form of social programming, which I think is interesting because governments do have more accountability, certainly than I do as a donor, to their recipients.
Please.
Hi, you guys have really blown my mind. This has really been really illuminating. So do you mind just slowing down on one thing to make sure I understand the chain, which is, you were saying it doesn't matter so much what people are spending the money on. You know, you committed to transparency and that's why you're showing it, but that's not your interest. Your interest is in things like this mattering scale. Can you tell me a little bit more about the things that you are interested in, and then whether those correlate with other things like civic participation or like, do they eventually loop back around to that other stuff, or that's also kind of out of scope?
Did you read my discussion paper? Yeah, I mean, you just articulated exactly what it is. And so what we're looking at is seeing, you know, if we introduce guaranteed income, do we then see a reduction? These are primary outcomes, you know, in stress and anxiety in a number of domains. And then do we also see an increase in mattering and hope? And so what that mattering and hope piece means is civic engagement, you know, engaging with one's community, feeling seen. And so some of it's on a real interpersonal level of, when I walk into a room, do people know I exist, right? Which sounds really squishy, but when we think about our policy landscape and our lack of trust in institutions and sort of our breakdown in public dialogue, it becomes really, really important because we're kind of having this reckoning. So it's sort of, yes, we are layering all of those things together, but then the other piece I would add is that, again, it's mixed methods. So it's not just, are we seeing movement on those scales, but then qualitatively finding, you know, following up and saying, like, what does this mean to you, like, in real time? The other thing I'd add to that, which I neglected to mention, is we're also looking at pooling. So what we mean by that is, how is the $500 distributed throughout networks, right? So people are really savvy. We have more women in the sample than men because women open the mail, and it was address-based sampling. And what we're seeing is that, you know, it's not just that individual who's receiving the guaranteed income, but that people are spreading the money throughout their fragile social networks. And that's one of the other key domains that we're looking at, is to say, how do people move money around within networks in ways that we typically don't count or think about it? And I'd point people to the financial diaries if you're interested in some of that methodology.
Thank you very much.
We're just at time. I want to ask one question we're going to do in less than a minute for folks who are interested in moving into this space, working in this field, thinking about it. You can answer any of the following. Who else do you watch? What do you read? Or any advice for people who want to do more on this work? You can take your pick.
I would say ignore a lot of the Twitter wars, because a lot of it's nonsense. And then in terms of who am I watching, you know, I'm looking for people who wear two hats, right? So I watch folks who are engaging in rigorous methodology while also engaging in fearless conversations. So a person I would point to would be Ann Price from Insight in Oakland, also Jhumpa Bhattacharya. I would also point to Aisha Nyandro from the Magnolia Mothers Trust, is that people who are, you know, one, centering black women, or two, centering people who are often kept out, and two, people who are unafraid to take a risk with their methods, but then also unafraid to have scary conversations, because they tend to be onto something. And those are the 3 names that I throw out there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would interview the jobs that you're looking at, which sounds obvious, but I think when you actually get into what is the impact of what you're doing, you'll get a very clear sense of whether they've thought about it, and you also get a clear sense of how the place is run, managed. I think there are high-performing, high-impact places out there, but you need to kind of filter through a bit.
I must say, the questions you like the least, you answered the best. We're so grateful to you for this panel and for this amazing conversation and for your amazing work.
Thanks for having
you.
us.
Thank you.
Thank you.